Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on Introduction to Privacy Red Teaming. Let's start with a quick introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Webher. I also go by V. I'm the founder and CEO of Privado.ai. Privado helps companies bridge the privacy engineering gap, like you all in the panelists as privacy engineers do. We have a privacy code scanning tool to do exactly the same. Over to you, Rebecca, for your introduction.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Balibacco. I have been in the privacy space since 2010 doing usable privacy and privacy engineering. I was at Google for 5 years, where I was part of privacy investigations, which is the privacy red team, more or less. And now I'm running my own company called Balibacco Privacy Engineering.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see so many people here, especially in California, since I think it might be on the earlier side. I'm a privacy and security researcher. Previously to my current role, I was at Apple, and I was there for 3 years. There, I did both kind of more classic privacy engineering in the sense of privacy feature review, and then kind of something that is probably most similar to the field of privacy red teaming, where I was a senior researcher in the field of offensive privacy. Yeah, so I think total, even before that, I was kind of doing some privacy research, so probably total in the field around 5 years, and then 3 years at Apple.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam, for that. And thanks, Rebecca. So I think before we kind of kickstart and go deep into red teaming, I just wanted to kind of acknowledge and spend a couple of minutes just talking about how kind of novel the community or the privacy red teaming community is. It's kind of doesn't have any standards. It's difficult to get it aligned across companies as well. So I'm curious to learn from both Rebecca and Sam about, your early experience, or if you can talk in general about, privacy red teaming and how early it is and where it is, in the journey of its maturity.
Sam, would you like me to start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing is that there are some larger companies that are doing privacy red teaming type things, but they're not really talking about it. So yeah, like you said, we don't really have a full community. We don't really have the standards. It's still sort of an emerging trend. And one thing I've been trying to do is publish lots of articles and get out there and say like what I think privacy red teaming is, and also just adversarial privacy in general. So I can go ahead and throw out a definition, and then Sam can perhaps give his definition, which may or may not be the same. So for me, adversarial privacy testing is you have to have an adversary, you have to have a motivation, and it has to be about user data. And privacy red teaming is one type of adversarial privacy testing that has all three of those elements. And a privacy red team is going to try to mimic an adversary in a safe environment so that users aren't actually harmed, and go through a full attack from beginning to end and try and see what would happen if a real privacy adversary were trying to get a hold of users' data or do something harmful with users' data. I spoke a lot. Sam, it's your turn.
Yeah, no, you didn't speak too much at all. So I think I would definitely agree in that for the privacy engineering field is somewhat new. I think the concept of privacy red teaming is nascent. And, there's only, I think, a few companies in the world that have like official teams that are kind of staffed to do privacy red teaming end to end. And even then, maybe there's a few other companies that kind of have that function being fulfilled by, maybe it's a couple individuals, maybe it's someone kind of taking on the role because of a need. But you generally see very little kind of official mandate from companies, despite, I would say, us living in a world where you do kind of have, and I'll kind of get to this term later on, but you kind of have like assurances being made about products and like promises.
Mhm.
This won't harm people. This is private. Our voice assistant, it definitely isn't listening at this moment in time, but despite huge amount of assurances from, apps to platforms to products to hardware, you generally have very little people actually saying like, well, let's actually go and kind of ensure that's the case, especially from a privacy impact, despite kind of regulators deeply caring about this, the public deeply caring about it. and most companies kind of putting huge marketing and kind of PR reputation behind it. So definitely a nascent field. Unfortunately, it's not maybe there enough, despite I think it needing to be. And then the way I would define it is actually kind of off that term, product assurances. So, it's
Mhm.
basically questioning product assurances, which I would define as like promises. And then you find deep technical answers that involve navigating kind of a series of fields, from security to machine learning to cryptography to personal safety, all in the pursuit of privacy impact. I think it's inherently cross-functional. And I guess I do have a slightly more product focus, but as opposed to maybe like a server side focus, but that's how I would define it.
No, that's awesome. I mean, on the panel itself, between the two of you, like one was that adversarial concept that Rebecca got in, and then the second is the assurance one that Sam was talking about. So it's kind of like getting to the same definition, but from different ends. And thanks for kind of kicking start that, right? Kind of defining what red teaming is and setting that up for the audience. One of the things that is probably much more established than privacy red teaming is a security red team. So I would be curious to learn from both of you. I mean, if you could explain how privacy red teaming is different from a security red team, are there similarities? If you can talk to that as well.
I'll go ahead and jump, and then I'll hand it off to Rebecca after. So I would say that, one, red teaming primarily operates in the concept of a secure development lifecycle. That kind of being that you maybe have a proactive security review and like security feature review. Then you might have, other activities like fuzzing and tooling. Then you're going to have maybe a red team doing like engagements. And then you might have kind of like more the reactive flow of kind of like incident response / vulnerability response. And this is, I think, common at most companies. I think like it's a pretty common concept. And I think red teaming, it can fit in a couple places in this flow. It can fit kind of after the kind of security review flow, where they're like, hey, we think this is going to come under high attacks. There's a big attack surface. We need a red team to kind of go really do in-depth analysis of the area. Or conversely, it could just be a red team that kind of operates in a like black box approach, where they randomly kind of go out and try and find security impact and focus on different areas. But regardless, it's always proactive. And in that sense, I think privacy red teams do fit into a very similar life cycle. Just as there's a security development life cycle, I like to think that there's a privacy development life cycle where it's very similar, just with privacy review, privacy incident response. It's a very similar concept. So I think a privacy red team could easily fit in that same proactive, in the same flow, being proactive. I think the one big difference between a maybe security red team and a privacy red team is that in a security red team, they're primarily, at least in my experience, they're either broken up on attack surface or kind of maybe they're going after a specific asset. So you might have some red teams focusing on browser or the rendering engine, and then they're kind of focusing on like one or zero click RCE, or it might be a red team focusing on websec or infosec issues. So they're typically focus on an asset, and you can specialize or attack surface, and you can focus on that attack surface. Or you might be focused solely on RCE or like getting credentials, and then you might do some like social engineering attacks. Privacy is one of the few, or a privacy red team is very unique in that you're going after an entire impact area, and you may have to go across every attack surface. There's attack surface for, if you have code execution, you're in an app on the device. What happens if you're a malicious base station and there's a cellular attack that can get your location? What about a server that has a GDPR violation, or, kind of like you're retaining data despite a GDPR deletion request? You have to go everywhere. So similar in the life cycle, different in that you're not going solely off of attack surface or asset. You're focusing on kind of impact, and that's unique.
Sorry, Sam, that's great. There's so much to chew on in what you said.
Yeah.
And I agree with a lot of it. I think also one way to differentiate between a security red team and a privacy red team, well, there's a lot of overlap, right? There's definitely like security red team work that'll identify vulnerabilities to user data. And that's, like good if a security red team can find that. I think it's like a Venn diagram where there's some overlap, but some things that are different. And so I think in particular, if we're using asset to mean sort of the same thing, it's like, what are they trying to get? A security red team might try to make sure that an attacker can't access the company's bank account or the company's proprietary information. Whereas the privacy red team, they don't care about that. They care about the user data. I mean, user, like people. You have data about people and we want to protect them. So that's going to be something that a privacy red team would focus on. And I think privacy red teams are much more likely to do stuff like, how re-identifiable is this data set? You said it was anonymized, but is it really? What kind of inferences can we make? I don't know of security red teams doing exactly that kind of work. So those are the things that I would sort of say are at the edges where like there's a lot of overlap, but there are things that one team would do that another wouldn't.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense. Also, like the impact concept that Sam you were bringing in, right? That's kind of like the use case, right? And we can tie it back both from a assurance perspective or a adversarial perspective, right? Let's say you're saying, hey, this message is going to be only be visible to your friends. And if that's kind of the promise which a feature made as part of a social media app, then is that because of some configuration change on some weird edge case becoming public? Is that possible? For someone, that's probably, something that you might be investigating. And that's not one asset, right? That maybe goes across multiple services written and there is some bad configuration or some feature flag which could lead to that. So yeah, that's something that a security red team would never bother about, because the data is safe, there's no attack, but it's just the promise is not, in some cases, not being met, and that's what you're trying to find as well. And then the same can be made true from an adversarial perspective as well, right? Like, is there some app which can be provisioned to get more data and then can go bad as well? So yeah, this was super helpful. And then just kind of doubling down, and I can see some questions that we already picked in so far, but so we kind of looked around what a red teaming is, how it's different from a security red team, but companies already have privacy programs, right? Some of the companies have privacy engineers, some of them have a better defined privacy program, and they're working with different teams, data teams, third-party risk management teams. How do companies who have a privacy program think about privacy red teaming? Are there certain companies where it's much better to add them? What are the benefits? If you can talk to like an existing program and how does privacy red team fit there, that would be amazing.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to sort of sideways answer your question. I think there are like many organizations that are still building out their privacy program, and maybe it's not ad hoc anymore, but it's not fully defined. They're not really doing like privacy by infrastructure. And for those organizations, a privacy red team isn't really going to make sense, right? There's a lot of other types of testing and measurement and assurance that can be done before a privacy red team is really needed, right? Because otherwise the work of the privacy red team is just going to be too easy. Like if you don't have a good privacy program, then it's
Yeah,
just, it's like,
you're going to
uh,
find all kind of issues. Yeah, for sure.
yeah. So you actually, or personally, I recommend that you start thinking about adversarial privacy or privacy red team when your program's a little bit more mature and you are making those assurances, as Sam mentioned, these promises to your users about how you're protecting your privacy, and you roughly feel like you can back it up, but you want to test it and you want to know, like, can we really justify what we're saying? So I would see privacy red teaming fitting in when an organization is a little bit more mature in their privacy organization.
So I think I can maybe focus on the like slightly larger corporation viewpoint, just due to kind of existing experience in my career there. I would say I definitely agree with some of the sentiments of Rebecca in that, and yeah, I think any red team will kind of, there's like, if someone's like, what is the con of any red team? The risk is that you start flipping bugs over the fence that people don't fix. So I think that kind of touches on a trend of like the red team field in general. But so I would say, what do you need if you're a large corporation? Why should you have a red team? Where can you insert it? One, have an existing and good privacy program. That's going to mean privacy feature review. That's going to mean, some type of privacy incident response. Maybe that's like actual engineers, maybe it's just EPMs or TPMs kind of doing remediation work. The point is, you kind of need to have people both reactively and proactively. Then they can, get a red team that says, hey, we're doing this in-depth feature review that says no one can learn X, but I only have, maybe a day to review this feature and I'm not an expert in X, Y, and Z. Let's go get the privacy red team and let them go deeper. Conversely, if, the incident response team is saying we're seeing every other issue related to kind of like shareable links getting indexed by mistake, which is kind of like a classic privacy issue. And I guess we'll get to that later on. Maybe they can say, hey, privacy red team, can you do an engagement and do like VA and shut this area down? So it fits in if you have a good privacy program, and or at least like an established, robust one. And I would also say you do need to have a secure development lifecycle, because at least in that lifecycle, you do get into this kind of concept of red team reports an issue, or you have like a vulnerability response team dealing with vulnerabilities and kind of like open CVEs, and you have to fix it. If, so at least there, I think it kind of establishes the concept within the company of this is X severity, you must fix it. Maybe there's kind of, sometimes it's the red team itself, sometimes there's like, there's maybe a separate design team, sometimes the red team does a mitigation design, but then you have a team that's available to help with design. You have, EPMs and TPMs that can prioritize actual mitigation getting shipped. So if you have a secure development lifecycle, you're probably fixing security issues. So at least you kind of have a concept of how you can start to fix privacy issues, and not just, oh, we're vulnerable A, B, C, D, E, F, but it's a lot of work to fix it and it's not a priority. As an organization, you've kind of agreed on priority, and then the existing privacy infrastructure and organization can kind of easily lend itself to having a privacy red team sit in it.
I want to pick up on a theme. Sam, you've mentioned a couple times incident management, and for some definitions of red team, that's incredibly important. I mean, historically, a red team is testing a blue team. They're testing to make sure, like, can our in-house defenses, protect, defend, even notice that we're being attacked. So in this sense, a blue team is kind of like an incident management team, incident management response. And so one of the benefits of a red team is of a privacy red team is to give the privacy incident management team a real test. Well, a fake test, a safe test, but a real life test. Yeah, do they have their playbooks? Do they make sense? Can they actually practice in a safe environment the incident response? Like, is it working? So yeah.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And as kind of you both were explaining about it, I had like a slight detour thought about companies are currently doing, I mean, from a testing perspective, if not red teaming, but they're definitely doing some compliance testing, right? Like, is my DSAR, if I get a DSAR, am I able to respond within time, or is the data being deleted? Like some compliance testing, or, like an audit which happens once a year, and are their ROPAs up to date, things like that, which is more around law, and are you passing the compliance obligation? How does that fit into a red teaming program? How does the red team help there? Or would you consider that as red teaming or not at all?
Yeah, so I think, and I kind of did like a little bit of a public post trying to hopefully get people in this talk, and based on the number of participants, I think hopefully that helped a bit. But I think one of the couple of things I mentioned was that, like, one, COPPA, and then two, kind of the idea of like taint propagation, maybe for like GDPR violations or like a GDPR deletion violation. And it's how many companies actually make sure, like, when you give someone submits a GDPR deletion request, or conversely, like a surface my information request, how many are 100% sure that you're actually doing that? Most, they'll do due diligence. Privacy review might say, okay, we're either ingesting new data, make sure you delete it. But how many actually can, with some degree of comprehensive certainty, say we are truly deleting it, and we have, an adversary trying to prove that we're not? Very few. So, the idea of a red team saying we're going to insert a fake user that, is clearly identifiable, and, it's an extremely unique name that's maybe even, kind of, maybe it's like some type of, alphabetical encoded nonce. You're going to see that no one is doing that to propagate taint. Go look for it. Where was it retained? Where did we actually not surface information? You kind of have deep regulator scrutiny, and you have deep fines of, GDPR violation. But how many people are doing deep due diligence to that effect? maybe some, maybe the largest corporations, but I doubt anyone other than the largest corporations that have the ability to have that type of tooling and infrastructure. And same thing for like a COPPA violation. How many people look like, okay, I have a child account, it's below 13, so we definitely can't collect data. How many people are truly checking that absolutely no, children's data is leaving the device? Oh, well, actually it's behind SSL pinning, so we can't see this packet. Are you bypassing SSL pinning at the kernel level? Are you like, oh, but there's a protobuf and we assume it's a serialized protobuf. Are you deserializing the protobuf and looking what's inside? Like, I think there is a bunch of, there's regulator scrutiny everywhere, and, rightly so. How many people are doing deep technical work to make sure they're abiding by it?
No, thanks, Sam, for adding that. And Rebecca, did you wanted to share something on that?
No, I love that. I don't have anything to add.
Awesome, perfect. So yeah, I think there was a question around it as well. One of the things that would be super interesting for everyone who are attending the panel is skill set, right? So essentially, if someone wants to get into become a privacy red team or join that team, what kind of skills are needed to be? How much of it is technical? How much of it can be learned? How can someone kind of become one? Those questions, if you can answer, would be super helpful.
Yeah. So I think packet sniffing already came up, understanding what's going over the network came up. I think Sam also mentioned the difference between whether you're doing black box testing or whether you have access to the source code and to the internal databases. And if you're not doing black box testing and you do have access to some of that stuff, then reading the code, you have to be able to read the code. Maybe certain SQL queries are going to be useful. So those are some of the technical skills. Sam, do you want to add more?
Yeah, I think, and maybe this is kind of one of the reasons, like, I think I found myself in the privacy field as a whole, is that it's one of the few fields where you get to care about different populations and actively, then kind of do very technical work around them. So I actually think for me, like, if someone was looking to kind of like join the team I was on, or they wanted to like work with me, or, maybe skills that I thought were crucial, like what made me successful was the ability to do threat modeling specifically on certain, in regards to certain populations and, specifically vulnerable populations. Do you understand the threat model for someone in an IPV population? And that's going to be an intimate partner violence situation, which is a kind of more formal domestic violence situation, or with a malicious partner. Do you understand that, maybe there's going to be, when they're about to flee, they might be in a crisis mode, when they, the malicious partner might actually have access to their phone and can easily coerce them for a passcode. How do you still hide information from someone or keep something private if they have access to the passcode? You get into a completely different privacy threat model of, okay, well, we're not going to retain this. If you, maybe certain parts have additional authentication, and you kind of get into a completely different threat model. And that's going to change, from, maybe that to what happens if you're now trying to protect sexual orientation or religious information, where, that information in a certain country can get you killed. And it's different. You have to understand populations. You have to understand what's going on in the world and how does privacy actually affect people. And that's to me, it's one of the reasons I got in the field. Is this is one of the few places you can get paid and have a career on how do you actually make the world a better place for certain groups of people. I guess, and the other one is slightly understanding different planes of attack surface. It's very different to say, okay, we're going to protect someone from a malicious base station, to you have code execution on your device on a BSD or Unix-based system. And, maybe we don't want certain system binaries to be invoked, because those system binaries can reveal things like, the computer name, or, maybe MAC address or something. That's very different than each other. And, you could even go further and say, like, now that you're doing like, an attack on internet infrastructure, they're all very different. You have to understand, like, what are the basics of cellular, what's possible in cellular. If you disable 2G connections, maybe you prevent the victim or user from calling emergency services if they're in a life-threatening situation. But you can also be tracked that way. Regarding code execution, how do you mitigate, something where maybe system binaries can yield a huge amount of information about the user? Well, now we're going back 20 years to the creation of BSD and unit. And so I think that's it. It's a, threat modeling for specific populations, and you have to understand different planes of attack surface because you can't mitigate it and you can't understand like what's possible, what's truly bad here if you don't understand the different ways and different avenues to attack someone.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Sorry, I just want to say I totally agree with Sam. Like that's so true. And like if you don't have empathy, like you're probably not going to be great at threat modeling. You're probably, I don't know, like is privacy even the space you want to be in? And I mean, I really, sorry, want to hit home this example of intimate partner abuse because it violates so many of our trust models. I mean, obviously for the people, but if you start looking at the kind of signals we use to detect like who someone is, then so much of that gets violated when you share the same living space or when you share a lot of these devices. And yeah, it's so important to think through these vulnerable populations. I don't know if we want to talk more about skill sets because like my guess is Sam and I could talk a very long time about vulnerable populations and why that's so important for red teaming.
yeah, I guess a broader theme definitely is one is the actual technical work, right? So you're trying to break stuff or find things, but there's also a big part of privacy red teaming, which, as both of you rightly put, is around threat model, starts with empathy, where it's also about writing the test before someone can check for that. And I would assume writing the test or thinking about it does require technical skills, but it does, but it's not exactly that you need to run an SQL query, but for it to happen, you need to first think of the right test, which needs to be thought from a user perspective, and then what the actual threat could be. So kind of at least you can at least start from a perspective of writing this test or thinking about these threats, and then obviously there's this huge technical work around debugging code or looking at network calls or packets as well.
Yeah. So that's all true, but I would put a little nuance on it. I think in my experience with some privacy red tech, you have to spend a lot of time on setup. You have to make sure you get the scope right. You define the adversary, you define how you're going to protect the user as you're testing them. As you're running the attack. But the actual test is not like a unit test where you can write it and run it ahead. It tends to be more of an attack where every day you're trying something and you're trying to see if it moves you forward, if it gets you closer to mimicking what an attacker would do. So it can be like step by step. And in my experience, usually you're working with a team and you have to go back to the team at the end of every day and say like what worked and what didn't work. And you have to listen to them and you have to be really creative. You have to be flexible. And your work doesn't speak for itself. You really have to be able to communicate it within your team during the attack as well as after. And I think that was something that Sam brought up at the very beginning of this, like what's worse than having a bug that doesn't get fixed? If you find stuff, you have to be able to communicate why it should be fixed, why this is important. You have to be able to tell those stories. You have to be able to go in and be like, what if this was your cousin who's being abused at home and like she or he, whatever, shared their phone and then this happened and then that happened and that happened. Are you okay with that? And then that's sort of if the person you're talking to has also empathy and that's the right way to communicate with them, it's going to get that bug fixed, right?
Yeah, and no, that makes complete sense. And kind of as we were going through the last 30 minutes of our conversation, one of the things that came up a couple of times in our conversation was these adversaries, right? And, I'm curious to learn what kind of these adversaries or potential adversaries are existing today that a privacy red team is looking for. If you can kind of define it, give some examples, that would be super.
Yeah, I'll start with that. And I think there's a whole range of privacy adversaries or like adversaries who have specific privacy motivations. So, and they range from like how many of them are there to like how many resources they have. So like one where there's maybe not that many, but they have a lot of resources would be the nation state adversary. And what in particular motivation, privacy motivation would they have? Well, maybe they're specifically looking for journalists or for opposition party candidates or, whatever it is. And they have the nation state absolutely intends to harm these people, right? Like if they can get information about these individuals, they're going to do bad stuff. So that's like one side of the spectrum. Another side might be just like, and this is the adversary where there's like tons of them, but maybe they don't have as many resources. And this can just be like the curious friend, right? Or like the everyday person. If you think of like patients' records in a hospital, this could be nurses or whoever staff who look at information of people who aren't their patients. Why? Well, it's their grandson and they're curious if their grandson's doing okay. Like that's not necessarily a
Mhm.
malicious motivation, but it's still not okay. Or it could be someone who's like looking up their ex-boyfriend to see if, what health issues they have, right? So like that's the type of adversary. They don't maybe if it's easy for them, if they don't have to jump over many hurdles, they're going to act on their curiosity or their jealousy or whatever human feeling they're having to try and get that information.
Yeah, I definitely a lot of those attacks. Yep, those are active concerns and attacks. And I think for me, the way I would kind of view it is it almost depends really on maybe the area you're looking at. Like per area, you can have different adversaries. If you're talking about like
Mhm.
who's an adversary in the browser realm, or maybe like dare I say like kind of messages realm where you're dealing with like remote vectors, it's probably gonna be the nation states. But then also if you're looking at a platform, it's also malicious developer, kind of like software, malicious app. Then if you're looking at kind of the user who's using it, now you are looking at an IPv situation, or to Rebecca's point, you leave your phone. I think the classic example I always used was you leave your phone at the bar, you go to the bathroom, someone's able to pick up your phone just based on the lock screen. What can they find out about you? Do you have a voice
Yep.
assistant that's enabled automatically? What can they find out about you through the voice assistant using it as an oracle? So you kind of have different threat actors per kind of maybe situation. And that's kind of at the platform level, it's at the product level, and then it's even kind of specific to like different vectors within the operating system. If you have like a vector for like like remote attack surface, I think then there's a completely different area kind of leaving the product and the platform, and then you get into like the server side issues, and then insider threat. I think that is an issue that I suspect unfortunately is widely ignored. The idea of, can someone, like, what can people access internally? A lot of times I think people say like they have a thing where they're like, no, 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 but they work at X company, they're brilliant, or they're amazing, we're all amazing at this company. And well, while that is true and people are amazing in general, that's not great for security or privacy. And you do have issues of, what is my ex partner doing? Does someone who maybe is an SRE or
Yeah.
has access to logs, do you want to go, let's say you work at an e-commerce company, what did that person buy? Where is their shipping and billing info? Like, and I don't think you do have a lot of people saying like, well, who accessed the logs? Let's do anomaly detection. Like, did you access it at 2 a.m.? Oh, why did you access it at 2 a.m.? Do you have some type of thing where every time it's accessed and maybe a SQL query is made, is that going to people's managers for review? Are those managers reviewing it? So I think unfortunately that is an area. And it kind of gets to a different threat model of, how do you protect something from the company itself? And some companies have constrained models here, like, oh, this company cannot find out your web history. If it's like a VPN, we promise not to log. But there's a lot of other situations where I don't think people do protect the user against the company. Can anyone find out your billing information if you buy something on Amazon.com? And I think there's even kind of like a big public scandal with Tesla where it seems that the Tesla recordings were being could be accessed by different Tesla employees, and they're sharing it, and for funny situations, or they're kind of sharing the videos around. I think that's telling. So yeah, the adversary can fluctuate based on where you're looking. It can also be the company itself.
Awesome. So this was pretty interesting so far, and we're going to jump to Q&A. But before we do that, I just wanted to probably take one or two real life examples which have been made public in the news that, like a typical example that a privacy red team would look like or try to avoid. So Sam, Rebecca, any examples that you want to share?
Sure. I'll do one and then I'll popcorn to Rebecca. So one actually, and this is actually something that a colleague or, just like a contact shared with me. They're like, do you know about this? And it was actually that the Google started to index Bard conversations that someone just simply shared the link. So you have a conversation with Bard, you want to share it with a colleague, a group of people, a spouse, you give them the link and you share it. And at that point, it basically got indexed by mistake on google.com. Clearly you meant to share the link, so that's the constraint, you have to share it, but you meant it with only the specific consent of who you're sharing it with, not with wider Google, because it wasn't, public, or maybe that's not even an option at all. So this is actually interesting because it's a class of privacy issue. This is going to be an issue for most cases where you're dealing with like a shareable link. And I bet most companies and most products, think anytime you want to share a link, maybe you have some type of app for reminders or notes keeping or a Bard conversation. Maybe, there's other, generative AI applications that you can also share it. This same attack would be applicable to them. So it is kind of interesting that a privacy red team would immediately see like, oh, shared conversation links got indexed by mistake. That's a very well-known class of privacy vulnerability. And then you can kind of both do VA on all the other, products that, on your platform where someone could share a link, but you can also be proactive and kind of work with, off the bat, if someone's about to do feature review and you have like, hey, we now have the ability to share links, you can say, well, are you making sure it's not going to get indexed? So I think it's a great example of it's a known issue that, maybe privacy red team experts would know about. And then you can either do, reactive VA, or you can do proactive work with a feature review team or the engineering team who's about to ship and say, wait, we're going to catch something before it goes. So
yeah, shared by links also, like, do they expire? Can the user delete them? Like, not everyone builds that functionality in. So yeah, shared by links definitely that's a tough area to get right. Like, if you're working on that, I think Sam's totally right. It's a place to pay attention and be careful, and where privacy red teams can come in. There was this, I don't think it was actually a breach. I think it was just a journalist who was checking and found that they could get into New York Transit Authority, I'm not sure,
MTA, yeah.
MTA, location history, like where people had traveled for the past week, just based on credit card information. And this, I think, is also a class of issues where the sensitivity of the information is way higher than the authentication or authorization that's required. So credit card
Yeah.
numbers, not unique, like not unique, not like great identify, like don't use those to like give away sensitive information. And location, and particularly like location over a week, is very sensitive because you're probably going to figure out where someone lives based on, or like very close to
And
which
the numbers are
metro
breached,
station.
right? Yeah, and
Sorry?
these credit card numbers are, I mean, they are part of some breach as well, right? So they are available for you to get
Yeah.
as well.
I mean, username and passwords are also like, they're reused and then they show up in these breaches and then people test them on things. And so we saw that recently
Yeah.
with 23andMe, where username and passwords, credential stuffing was used, and then they were able to get genetic information about other people because of this feature that works as intended. Okay, I'm not a 23andMe user, so I don't know the specifics of this feature, but my understanding is like, if I used it, I could go look up everyone who has DNA similar to me. And those people, I guess, don't really have control over like how good my password is. So, I mean, I think that's such a great example of something that a privacy red team might catch. 23andMe is saying, oh, this is not a data security incident because it's, they're saying like, oh, it's the user's problem because they didn't have good passwords, and that feature was working as intended. So the combination of these things. So anyway, I think that's another class of issue when you have like sensitive data that's not protected by by the level of authorization or authentication that it should be protected by.
Yeah, and there are more probably like we might push some links, especially when we're sharing the webinar. I think the most famous one, there's one famous one around Strava, the Netflix anonymize or de-anonymization of public data for the price set. Couple of the famous ones that I could see. Awesome. So now we're going to move on to Q&A. But before we do that, I know, Rebecca, you offer, some courses around, and you have some things around privacy red teaming. So if you want to talk about it for a minute, and then we jump into Q&A as well.
Yeah, so I put together a webpage for people at this webinar, and it's at my URL, privacyengineer.ch, ch because I'm in Switzerland, /Privado. Privado's the sponsor. So it's privacyengineer.ch/Privado. It has a list of like free articles, a free guide to privacy red teaming, and then I noticed right before this, I don't actually have my courses listed, but I do offer some courses. And if you are an IAPP member, it has like, you get credit for it and so on. So yes, please, I will add the courses to that page afterwards, but privacyengineer.ch/Privado.
Awesome. Perfect. Thanks for that. So we're going to go into questions. We already answered some of them. There are some unanswered that I'm going to pick. But for the audience, if there are more questions, feel free to add them. We'll try to answer as many as possible. So the first question is, do you have to be familiar with the technical aspects of offensive security to perform privacy red teaming?
I don't feel like I'm a security expert. When I was at Google, I sat next to the offensive security team, and they just blew me away with their knowledge and like always staying on track of specific vulnerabilities. I didn't have that knowledge. And yeah, I think having that knowledge on the team can be really helpful, but I don't think you necessarily need. It's great to have it on your team to complement.
Yeah, I think, maybe it kind of came up in the different threat actors, but sometimes like if you are kind of saying, okay, we're going after the nation state and we're making sure that they can't find your location. You're going after some very, very intelligent people with a lot of resources. Probably are going to need to know offensive security because they're going to know it. If they can pop your phone, well, it's all over.
Yeah.
But at the other end, to do, kind of like personal safety threat modeling, or even like what should someone be able to learn, kind of simply off of an unauthenticated, device where they have access to the phone and they have the lock screen. You don't. What happens about the insider threat? You don't. There's some realms where, it does kind of, and I would say maybe like the term isn't like offensive security, but there are some times where you do need to know like technical, kind of like in-depth knowledge if you do want to go after certain attacks. Like if you want to do, like, okay, well, we're going to do proxying off the device for network communications. Oh, wait, there is SSL pinning involved. It might help to know like, well, okay, how do I kind of bypass this? So I would say that depending on your threat actor, sometimes offensive securities could be needed because they might be having that knowledge. Sometimes maybe a better word is you might have to have in-depth technical knowledge for a certain area, because then that helps you both mitigate it. It helps you understand like how do I even test this? You just need to have in-depth knowledge. But it also, there's a huge amount of threat actors where you don't need that. You need someone to care. You need someone to be passionate and have a mandate saying, make sure, this assurance is protected. And that involves, kind of maybe reaching out to the right teams. Maybe you're, the privacy red teamer and you're saying, oh, I do need help bypassing SSL pinning. Reach out to the offensive security team and get help from them. And they'll be able to help you pretty easily. And then now you're doing like taint propagation to find a GDPR kind of deletion violation. And you reach out to the privacy infrastructure team and you learn and you grow. Maybe that's kind of the major skill that you need to have as a privacy red teamer. It's okay not to know everything. I felt like an idiot the vast majority of the time in my job because you're in an area where you have to go across every single area from Bluetooth to Wi-Fi to, cellular to server-side systems that have deep data engineering infrastructure to web security issues. And you learn and you grow. And you're not going to know everything because you're, unless you're like a distinguished or principal engineer somewhere. So
even then, you don't know everything.
I think that's it. Just grow, and maybe that's the chief skill set you need to make it in privacy red teaming.
No,
And I think if you're
thanks
an org,
for
Sorry, I wanted to add to that. If you are a company that's thinking of setting up a privacy red team, one thing you can consider is supporting rotations. So, for
Yep.
example, if the privacy red team is going to do something, I mean, I never did taint propagation, but like on anonymization or something, then maybe your organization will support pulling someone from the anonymization team into the privacy red team for 6 weeks or 2 months. And just to have that expertise, and then they learn a lot as well, right? They suddenly get this adversarial mindset. They can go back to their team and start integrating it into their work. Even, if they're software engineers and now they're thinking about adversaries. So yeah, you don't need to know, you can't know everything. You don't need to know everything. You just need to know who to ask and where to get help.
No, thanks for that. And probably we have a couple more questions, but I find this question from William pretty interesting. It's privacy is about kind of risk management and also has a perspective of human rights protection. So how does red team address this human right aspect? How do you test for human rights?
Yeah, so I'll try and tackle that first. I think the way that I personally view all of my privacy work, but in particular adversarial privacy testing, is that we're not aiming for the legal standard. We're aiming for what protects the user. Like and by user, I mean whoever's in your data set. They might not actually be your user, right? Like think Equifax or something but like you're always thinking about protecting the people. And it's not about legal compliance. Legal compliance is a bare minimum standard. You can go deeper than that.
Yeah, I think for me, maybe I'm going to kind of tie on the idea of like, privacy assurance or kind of like a privacy
Yeah.
promise, or even just like wider promises, like we keep the user safe. Someone can't be tracked this way. I mean, in the sense that you are doing risk management, there's deep PR impact, like to any company that, whether it's like a conference, kind of like a security conference that someone's published on them or an academic paper. I mean, if you actually take the article that was shared about Netflix, where it was kind of like the Netflix prize data set, and then very famously it was de-anonymized, that had a whole bunch of PR and marketing risk. And
Yeah.
I would say that probably did damage to Netflix's, image and that entire prize. So, I would say going kind of like doing the threat modeling, kind of protecting your users, it is risk management in the sense that you are protecting kind of the company's interests, and the company wants to keep its users safe. It wants the users to trust the company. There's impact there, but then equally human rights protection are, typically things that do matter to the user. So you can do both by, doing privacy red teaming. You're both protecting the interests of the company, which is having a loyal user base, having users that trust a product, not having PR and marketing damage, which companies spend a lot of money on. And then at the other end, it's, you're protecting the user itself who's using the product and saying, you have your own expectations that we know you expect of this product. How do we kind of abide by those? So I think they're almost one and the same, in that if you can
Yeah.
do, it's like two birds with one stone. It matters to the company and it matters to the user.
Matters to the Yeah. I love how you reframe the human rights test to saying, hey, just change it and flip it into the assurance or the expectation and what's needed for even from a company perspective, because then it becomes like everyone is aligned on the same thing. We also have another interesting question on risk quantification. So it's about, is it easy to quantify risk and privacy than security? I would think it should be harder, but or at least we don't have the right models or frameworks ready, or public or open source like security has. But the question is around like something like a GDPR privacy regulation issue in a server is easy to quantify, but baseband attack might be difficult to quantify. I think Sam, you mentioned that. Do you want to give a quick response on this?
Sure. So yeah, and this kind of gets into like attack surface and like understanding, like when I was like understanding both the threat modeling for each attack surface, but also like what's realistic, so if you understand like, anytime you're dealing with like a baseband issue, a cellular issue, well, it's remote and it's going to probably involve location. So, you can go off of like the asset gained, but you can also argue this is how it works. So you have to balance both like what is the asset gained with sometimes the constraints of the attack surface. And then also like the ability to like, do you have to get specialized equipment? And then at the other end, you can have like a regulatory issue where maybe you have deep turnover, but maybe there's also time, for some of these issues that maybe might not be P0 where you have to like fix it in the next 2 days. Maybe it's, hey, we found an issue. The GDPR regulation actually gives us a couple months once we find an issue internally to fix it. Let's do so. So it's not, risk is hard. It's definitely hard. And I'm sure it's hard in security too, but you're weighing a bunch of things. You're weighing like, what asset does the adversary get? Who is the adversary? An issue exploited by a nation state is going to be much higher risk than an issue kind of where the company learned something they shouldn't. But so it's going to be the adversary, the asset, tooling, and how hard is it to actually exploit. And then, so I would say it is hard. This is where maybe there's been some work around like privacy vulnerability modeling and privacy threat modeling. And I think there's been a couple of things at Pepper about that.
Yep.
But I would say this is a very hard thing. And it's hard because you have to weigh like 4 different competing levers. And
I think there's a real opportunity for the privacy engineering community to classify, to come to a standard on privacy vulnerabilities. I know the security community more or less has, I mean, people may argue about it, but they have some sort of like definition of what different vulnerabilities are. And
They have a score attached to it. Yeah.
they can have a score, and we don't have that in privacy. And if we had that, it would open so many doors, right? Like it doesn't even have to be perfect. It just has to be something we can all agree on. Like that would be so fantastic.
this is where I would love like more regulatory scrutiny. I don't yeah, yeah, I'm sure there's a whole bunch of people who work for companies on this chat who are like, that sounds awesome. But for the users, because I think right now, every now and then you hear it on the news, like a regulator will like, oh my God, we didn't know this was possible, or like, how could this? And I think if they knew, or, kind of some of the threats or kind of, and then, maybe some of the impact you can get in this field. And they said, actually, companies maybe need to, if they have this type of issue, they need to fix it in this time frame, they need to report it, they need to publicize it, like maybe even mandate VA within certain timeframes. I think this could be something where like regulators or like could do interesting work on kind of like, well, we have all this privacy regulation, but let's actually make sure we're being adversarial about it and enforcing it. And there's actually like penalties. So I think it's an open area for regulators too.
So I agree, but it doesn't need to be regulators. I think there are technical standards communities who could start this. If regulators are interested, great. Maybe it can come from privacy engineers first.
So I posted a link on, I found this application privacy standard, which is open to comment till 30th November 2023. I find it super interesting because the security part of it, or mobile app sec part of it, is pretty famous, and they're trying to do it, and it is by OWASP. So,
Okay.
and they're trying to do it for privacy. So yeah, it's open till I think 30th November. Everyone can comment and make it better. So we'll at least have something for apps. It won't be perfect, but there'll be at least something to start as well. Awesome. I guess I did not realize we are almost towards the end of the webinar. So first of all, thanks both to Sam and Rebecca. I learned so much, and we were able to cover most of the questions, if not all. We do have an active Slack community of privacy engineers. So folks who still have questions or want to discuss more, feel free to join that. And then, we can have some of these discussions offline. As you can see, everyone is passionate about the topic as well. And yeah, thanks everyone for joining in.
Thank you. It was great.